Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we are actually redoing one of our webcasts, which is around using Microsoft GraphClient within SharePoint Framework. So this is something which we did a webcast in February 2018 when it was in preview, and now we're going to do a refresh now that the functionality is in general availability. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm Senior Program Manager from Microsoft and SharePoint Engineering. And with me today is Waldek. Waldek, will you do the quick intros as well?
Yeah, sure, everybody. Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Alek Mastis. Gosh, I work at Rancor. And today we will talk about using MSGraphClient within SharePoint Framework again, but then using the bits that are generally available.
Indeed, indeed. So in February 2018, we released the preview, and there has been small changes since the preview and for impact, small adjustments on the functionality since the preview. But we'll concentrate what it is actually in GA. We're not going to concentrate on if you have a solution, how you migrate that to the GA, because you actually should start pretty much from scratch, or at least approve all of the permissions. What does that mean? Let's get back on that one in a few slides. Now, let's actually start moving on forward. So first of all, let's actually go still back, and I do apologize on that. So let's quickly explain what is Microsoft GraphClient before we go to how do we actually use that. So Microsoft GraphClient in the SharePoint Framework components gives you the capability of accessing Microsoft Graph information, so information exposed by the Microsoft Graph. And using the Microsoft GraphClient in your components, you don't have to worry about the token handling, you don't have to worry about the scopes, what you actually have, and it's a super easy way of hitting the Microsoft Graph REST point in your code, as long as the needed scopes for the URLs which are hitting, the REST APIs we are hitting, have been approved. And that's really the key point here of what we're providing with SharePoint Framework. So we're providing a centralized governance for Tenant Administrator to approve what is the information, what are the custom solutions can actually access through Microsoft Graph. Really, really important thing. Cool. Now, the question is, what does it mean if I use Microsoft Graph within a SharePoint Framework? And let's see a live demo on this one from a Waldek screen in a second. Now, how do I actually use this? Obviously, you will need to write some code. This is a developer webcast, so it's all about writing code. But you write a code which is using the Microsoft GraphClient to access the Microsoft Graph APIs. And this is actually super simple code. The piece of code is like 6 lines, roughly, depending on how many, well,
how many entries
one line. Exactly. Technically, it could be one line. Now, but it is seriously super simple to access the information. Now, to be able to hit the REST API and for the plumbing, the work and everything, you need to have the right permissions. So first of all, you need to, as a developer, you need to know what permissions and scopes you need to request. And in the demo, we'll actually show you how to figure out what are the scopes based on the Graph documentation. Inside of the solution, you actually define that, hey, this solution requires the following scopes. So because it's hitting those certain specific REST APIs, and you define those in a package solution JSON file. So at this point, then the tenant administrator goes and uploads the SPPKG file, which is the solution package, to the app catalog of the tenant. And at that point, we will show a message for the tenant administrator, which will say, hey, there are requirements for following, there are requirements to approve permissions inside of this SPPKG file. Please go and check the pending permissions before you start using the functionality. And this is where that tenant administrator either uses the admin UI, the modern, well, it's modern now, but it's not modern probably in 2 years. But anyway, the new admin UI, or SharePoint Online Shell commandlets, or Office 365 to approve the requested permissions. Sorry, were you planning to say something, Waldek?
No, not anymore, no.
Cool. Sorry. But anyway, so to be able to access the REST API in Graph, tenant administrator need to approve those requests. And then when you put the component, SharePoint Framework component, is it an extension? Is it a web part? Doesn't really matter. If you use the MSGraphClient in your code, it will, let's say, automatically do the plumbing of token handling and everything else underneath the covers for you. Now, Maybe quick side note on this one. So if you need to just get access on the access token, or the token itself and not just use Microsoft GraphClient, you can actually do that starting from the GA version as well. So you can use the access token, just with the REST API. If you, apparently, I'm not an Angular guy, but apparently Angular guys don't want to use necessarily Microsoft GraphClient or the Azure AD HTTP client. They want to use their own HTTP REST client. So using the GA version, that's more easily possible. Those weird Angular guys. No, just kidding. Now, considerations. So a few things to kind of consider before we go to the actual demo and see this in practice. There is no pre-approved permission scopes for Microsoft GraphClient. So by default, the tenant administrator has to grant a certain set of permissions before the functionality actually works. You will need to have a tenant administration permission to approve the additional scopes. And this really comes down on that centralized governance and centralized control in a tenant level. That the tenant, it might be if it's let's say it's a large enterprise tenant, they're probably a group of people who actually make these decisions, and they need to consider what are the scopes which we want to approve or provide for our customizations. So not just randomly approve whatever is being requested necessarily. Granted permissions apply to all JavaScript components running in a tenant. So even though you're requesting the permission in one solution, when you grant the permission, it is actually across all of the SharePoint Framework solutions, which are running in a tenant. Really important thing to realize. And this is obviously the many people are always asking then, why can't you actually approve scopes for individual solution level? Right now, when we're recording this video, that's not actually possible due to the level of granularity what Azure AD gives us in the context of SharePoint. So the GA of current functionality means that the granted permission apply to all JavaScript components. Maybe in the future, we'll have more granular permission scopes per solution. Maybe. We'll see. One step at a time. And this capability is available across all tenants starting from September 2018. So if you're running SharePoint Framework 1.6 or newer, this capability is available in SharePoint Online. Obviously, Microsoft Graph capabilities are not available in on-premises, just to be super clear on that. I'm waving my hands in the small video as well. Now, anything what I'm missing? A lot of talking.
Well, yes, I would clarify a bit the point where you said that permissions apply to SPFX. Well, they actually apply to every single piece of script across the whole tenant, right? Imagine that you've built 5 years back
script. It depends on what I mean.
Piece of JavaScript you put on a page, right? So imagine 5 years back. Yeah, 5 years back you would build a widget that shows you the weather, and now you grant permissions to the Microsoft Graph or an API that you've built.
Yeah.
Well, that widget script coming from CDN could use, in theory, the same permissions to access Graph. Correct. So basically, you open up an API for any piece of JavaScript running on your tenant.
Correct. And that's why it's super important to make that decision knowingly at what scopes do you want to approve within your tenant. Now, from a developer perspective, the ask would be that, well, we got this asked many times in SharePoint Engineering, which was like, well, why can't I access all of the information in the Microsoft Graph? Why is it so difficult to access that? From a developer perspective, it makes sense. It would be brilliant to be able to access all of the goodies what Microsoft Graph is actually exposing, which is a lot. It's a brilliant API, and it's expanding enormously all the time. Now, the challenge of that one is that then the small piece of code can access all of the information in Microsoft Graph. That is actually also the challenge, because it might be that there's an information which the enterprise or company doesn't want a random piece of JavaScript to be able to access. And that's why we have the approval of scopes, and that's why we have this governance on top of the Mac GraphClient. So for the developers who are asking, like, why is it so difficult? Well, it is difficult because customers want to have security and control on this thing. So
and also there's another thing, right? You mentioned also that why isn't there a way to grant permissions to single solution? Well, the reason for that is that if you understand how OAuth works, it's always related to a domain.
Sure.
And in SharePoint, all scripts live on the same domain, which is your tenant. And also, it's all scripts. So a script cannot hide a token from anything because it lives on the same page. So if one script can get a token, any other piece of script can do the same. And any other piece of script across the whole tenant can request the same token. So with that, in the current setup, it's just physically impossible to do it. And for that to work the way you think it should work, well, you would have to think about something that we had with add-ins, where each add-in lived on a subdomain and was separated from everything else. In that way, yes, that way you could do it, but then you have to think about iframes or separate webs. And, exactly.
Yep.
So only then you would be physically able to isolate that in browser.
Sure. True. And sure, we're recording this in September 2018. Sure, we are looking into and announcing something preview. We talked about the isolated web parts actually in SPC already in 2018 spring. So we're potentially looking into heading to this direction. But for now, when we're recording this as a GA of the Microsoft Graph Client usage, there is no granular level of permissions. They are granted for the whole thing. Now, potentially in the future, who knows? This might be completely virtual. It's only Microsoft Spaces and SharePoint Spaces.
Maybe it's already in the past by the time you watch the video. So
you never know. That is absolutely true. Now, let's actually interesting philosophical questions. Now, let's go to the actual demo. So let's jump on the Walter screen and let's have a look on how this looks in practice. So what do we need to do? A simple web part, really concentrating on the simplicity of the story. Also just advertising this as well. SharePoint Starter Kit is then showing you a slightly more complex stuff as well. But let's jump on Walter screen and let's have a look on this one in practice and then get back on the slides and close up the webcast.
All right. So to illustrate how you can use the Microsoft Graph inside SPFX, we want to build a simple web part that will show the latest few emails that you received in your inbox. And we want to get that from Graph, right? So the first thing is to find out which permissions we need for Graph, because they might or might not be available already. And I think it's a good approach to have them listed in your package, because that way it will be easier for everybody else to track what your package actually does. So here we are in the Docs for Graph. We go to Docs. In here, we scroll down because we want to know more about the API that we want to use. So we scroll down to the V1 reference to email because we want to show the latest emails. Here we go to messages. And then the operation is list messages. And then here we see that we need at least mail read operation, right? Because we don't need to write anything, we just want to read. So this is permission for Graph that we have to include inside the package. Yep. Let's go to code, and we already created all of the code because there is no point in you watching us type. But so this is the code that we will use, right? So we first start with going to the config package solution, and in here we add new property named Web API permission requests. And these are permission requests that your package will request for additional APIs secured with AAD. And that can be either the Microsoft Graph or any other enterprise API that your company owns. So in our case, we want to access the Microsoft Graph. So here we added a resource named Microsoft Graph. And this part can be either a name or a GUID. But the benefit of using a name is obviously that it's easier to see what it is. But also, if you are an ISV, that name is constant across tenants. That GUID isn't. So if you want to build, if you want to build a package once and reuse across different environments, using a name allows you to actually do that. If you would use a GUID, you would need to repackage your solution for every single tenant, which isn't efficient, really. All right, so we start with naming the resource and then permission scope that we want to access. In our case, it's only email read, mail read. Imagine that if you wanted to access also the calendar, you would request them both, right? So you would copy the section, the request, and then add another one for calendar read. So if you want to request multiple scopes, you don't add them in single line here. No, you add new section for each permission scope you want to access or you want to request. So
which isn't, by the way, super optimal, but that's fine. That's how it has been now implemented. So okay.
Yes, it is the way it works, and one of the reasons for that I can imagine is that some permissions might be already available.
True.
And if you would separate them by strings, then when applying that, the string would have to be separated and split and compared, whether just having one resource scope pair is easier to deal with, right? So this is the way it works. So with this in place, we are ready now to write our code, to actually use the MSGraphClient to communicate with the Microsoft Graph. So we go to the code, and in here we have a web part built with React. So we have two pieces. We have the web part code, and we have component built in React that actually retrieves the data and shows the data. The way it works is that you first need to get the instance of the MSGraphClient in web part. And one way to do it, the way that I find most efficient, is to do it on init, right? And that's the part that has changed between the version. Was this announced in 1.4 or 1.5?
1.4.1.
1.4.1 even. Okay. So originally this piece worked differently. Now there is a MSGraphClient factory from which you get the client instance, and that works with a promise. Yeah. So in the past, what you would see is that people would do it inside React component, but then due to the promise, it might get confusing with how you deal with that, with handling the events in component and all that. So easier way to do it is to do it in web part on init, because that already works on a promise, and then just store a reference to that. Yeah. So even if component would refresh, reload, or you would have more of them, you can retrieve it once, because that reference doesn't change. So you can just get it once, have it available, and then pass it to React here, right? So here we create we get the instance because it is already available. We start it in a variable in our web part class, and then we pass the reference to React component here. So this part is done, and all of the logic is actually done inside React component. So here we move
now, before you go there, just a word about quite often actually we see also the context being passed on the component. But like you said, this way you don't actually bypass the component, and you don't have to copy the Microsoft GraphClient factory inside of the component. So getting the factory users there. You only give up the relevant component inside.
And actually to talk about that, there's also another downside of if you would pass the whole context to React. Imagine now that you want to build a unit test for a React piece.
Yep.
You have to mock the whole web part context, even though you only use one single piece of it.
Yep.
Right? So that gives you a lot of overhead to deal with in your tests that you actually don't need, right? Because the GraphClient doesn't expose that many objects and methods, whereas the context of a web part has everything on it. It has graph, it has AAD, it has token provider, properties of page, and more. So you would need to expose all of that on your mocks in order to be able to build tests, which is a lot of overhead. So always try to pass as little info, the minimal info that you actually need, and not everything. Anyways, going to React, in here, we start with the component did mount, which will be run whenever component loads on a page initially, right? And in there we say, at this stage, when component is available on a page, we want to communicate with the Microsoft Graph and get emails, right? So we will do that here. And in here, we retrieve the GraphClient from properties that we passed in the web part. So in the web part, we pass the instance of GraphClient to React component, and in here we get it, we retrieve that, and basically this part is using the MSGraphClient to communicate with the Microsoft Graph. Yep. So we call the /me/messages API version 1. We retrieve the body, receive data from, subject, web link, and we get either the specified number of emails or 5 if none, and we order them descending on receive time. Yeah. So we load all of that, and then we show them finally in React component. So this is it. This is how it works. How about we build it and see it in action and see actually the steps involved with deploying the package to SharePoint, approving permissions, and everything that is needed for it to work as expected.
Yep.
So I've already built the project and package. I have it here. So here let me switch first to the app catalog, to which we will add the package, and then also grab the package itself is the sppkg, and let's just easily drag and drop it here again to actually deploy it. And the important part is here. Let me just enable this one so that the web port is available on all sites. I don't need to think to which site I want to add it. But the really crucial part is this piece here. Because in our package, we include request for an API access, which is this part here. So we did this. We went to package solution. Because we included this part, we now get a warning being tenant admin that this package will request access to some API secured with AAD. This is important part. It requests the access. It doesn't mean it will get it. That is up to you, but it requests it. And it says, go to the service principal permission management page to approve them or not. Right? So this is important part. At this stage, it doesn't open anything up yet.
Precisely, and that's actually the, if you now click the deploy, this is the moment when actually technically the web part is already available, but it does not yet work because the scopes have not yet necessarily been approved, which hopefully is just a momentary few minutes, and that won't cause any problems. To be fair, in the web part implementation, you should always consider the fact that what if I don't actually have the scopes available, so you deal with the exceptions gracefully. So.
Yeah. So now we go to the tenant admin, and let me go to that from the start, right? Because otherwise you will not know how we arrived here, and I've already done a few steps. So here we start with the admin center, and to access the API management, we have to go to the new SharePoint admin center, which we can access from here.
Which it says try preview, but technically, well, this particular functionality is not available except in this preview UI.
So there is no other place to access this. Correct. And in here, we go to the API management page. And now you can see a pending approval for the Microsoft Graph mail read API that we requested in our package. Now, if for some reason you deploy the package, but this guy isn't here, there is a chance that that an error has occurred deploying the package, and you just missed that. So always first ensure that there are no errors here, because it might trip you a few times, and it's not really easy to see, because if your screen is wide or big or small, that column might fall off the screen, and you will not see it, but you will also not see the request there. Right, so always check the column that there were no errors during deployment. Anyways, so in our case, we have the request, and in our case, we are okay with approving the access to that API. Again, to underline it, when we do that, it will allow every piece of JavaScript in your tenant to access that permission or to access that API. So now we click approve and reject, and here we can see requested by, requested from which package, version, requested date, and we say approve. And at this stage, UI refresh, partly because it's still pending approval. It's already approved here. When we refresh this page, the request is gone now, is 0, and then we see 2 approved permissions in here. And at that stage, that means that we can now safely add the web part to the page, and it should work. It should be able to call the Microsoft Graph. So in here, let's go to our page. Let's edit a page. And here we will add a web part named personal email, which is the web part that we've built. Personal email, and I see 3 of them. Apparently, my manifests are cached, and this is a tenant that I use for other things as well, so I see 3 of them. Let me add 1, and I'm not even sure if they're all the same or not. So now we are retrieving messages, and there you go. It works, right? So now we can see the 5 recently received emails in my inbox, and that just works. So I didn't need to do anything specific regarding setting up AAD. All of that is already done because in here we use the existing MSGraphClient, which is a part of SPFX, which already does all of the heavy lifting for us. Right,
now,
so
this particular web part, by the way, is originated from the SharePoint Starter Kit, but I think we'll provide the web part source code as a separate sample as well, because it is the most simplistic, easy way to get started on graph samples as well. And if you're a presenter in any conference, this is a great demo web part as well to just really concentrate on what's happening here.
Yeah. And now I think, do you want to talk about what will happen when you don't have the permission scope? We want to show that?
Well, we can. But basically it's a exception handling, right? It also depends on what happens on your web part. So, how you implement the exception handling, which is good way to remember to deal that gracefully. Either if your design is that you say a nice message for end users that I don't yet have permissions, that's fine. Maybe permission saying maybe a message on a web part page, which is auto page saying, sorry, I don't have permissions, can be highly confusing for end user. Maybe the web you don't want to show anything. So again, based on the admin design, correct. Yeah. Contact admin can be super confusing message as well, but again, so it's
have a way to deal with it. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah,
that's
and I guess it's also and it's also important to understand that at this stage, this permission API or this API permission is not related to the package. So we can remove it here, and the package will work just fine. It will be still available in catalog. Nothing has changed here, and you can still add the web part to the page. So at this point, they are decoupled. But if it doesn't work, and probably now the token is cached, so we have to clear the token. It's still there.
Gonna work for a while, but then at some point it's gonna break, which is a good reminder also on the timing. So not all of the things are completely immediate. So.
Exactly, because the token is cached, and I think the token is good by itself for an hour. So as long as the token didn't expire and session is valid, you will still be able to use the web part.
Yeah, that is true.
I guess that's it, right?
I think that's it. We went through the code, we went through the documentation where you can see the needed scopes. Microsoft Graph documentation also up there by Microsoft Graph team. And they're making further investments on that side. Then we showed the code. We showed that the code in the React way of implementing stuff just as well. The same Graph client works in exactly the same way, regardless are you using React, Vue, Angular, whatever you're using. So it doesn't really, the difference of that one is different. The only really difference here was that we used the React component and the properties to bypass the Graph client in, which is a React-based implementation. But I think in general that's it for this one. We'll add links obviously on the sample on the webcast recording. So let's flip on the slides and close up the webcast. Cool, excellent, good file, great demo and good walkthrough of things. And like I said, we didn't intentionally, you didn't want to have the web part super complex. It is relatively simple web part, really concentrating on the story of things, because obviously you can create much more complex solutions, and the SharePoint Starter Kit, like mentioned a few times already, is a good example of that. But understanding what happens is really the key with the simplistic solutions. Now, let's go to the final slide, and any other conclusions, other things which we want to repeat from this one, Balder?
I think simplicity is the key, right? If you think about it, what would you have to do yourself if we didn't have the clients that we get from SPFX?
Yep.
It's not trivial. There are quite a few things like redirects, pop-ups, iframes to take into account to implement all of implicit flow by yourself.
Yep.
That these clients take away, allowing you to focus on the thing that you have to build. Yep. It makes it so much easier, and I think it's really a great addition to the platform. And as such, it allows you basically to focus more on your job and not plumbing and off.
Correct. And that's absolutely that's where the IT always should go. More abstraction, more simplification of things, making things simple. If things start feeling more complex, that is not the intention. To be fair, if you're a classic SharePoint developer coming from FAM solution, moving to SharePoint framework, it might feel slightly more complex for a while. But at this point,
it's different than it's new.
Exactly. It's different than it's new. It's not actually more complex. You can't beat the complexity of feature framework. So
feature XML, yes.
Exactly. There's no way for beating that complexity. So trust me, I know. Anyway, I think that's all we're going to do in this webcast. So thank you for watching, and we'll have links on all of the things what we mentioned in the video notes or in the blog post related on the webcast. So thank you for watching. Give us feedback, give us input. You didn't like something, you like something, ping us in Twitter and social media and let us know. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.